Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler, and thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there, and I'm ready to go. Looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 229. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about memorials, battlefields, and Mount Vernon as we go to Northern Virginia.
Got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into today's interview, I do have three news stories for you. One is, next time you're packing and you're going to Israel, don't pack your iPad. They are not welcome. They are actually being intercepted by customs agents because they don't meet the standards for Israel yet, and so they can't be allowed in the country. But at least you'll be packing lighter. And speaking of people who need to learn how to pack lighter, Joan Collins, apparently, when she travels between her home in the U.S. and her home in London, brings 30 different suitcases, Louis Vuitton cases, and spends $4,966 for each trip just for her luggage. And she should definitely try and avoid Spirit Air, which we talked about last time, is charging now for carry-on bags. And the most recent announcement from Spirit Air is now they're thinking about adding non-reclining seats. They're just messing with you at this point. For links to all those stories, check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. Before we get into the interview, I did want to say two things about the Egypt photography tour. One is, if you're interested in that tour, especially if you're interested in the optional cruise, you really need to book now because that cruise is filling up. That's going to fill up before the land tour does. And the second one is, last week on the show, I mentioned a discount that was incorrect. That discount only applies if I'm not on the trip. So I can get you 10% off all of the Globus tours, but not this particular one. So the original prices I had on that tour were correct, and what I announced last week, just ignore that. So I hope some more of you will decide to come. We have started to sign some people up for that tour, so I'm starting to get very excited about it. I'd like to welcome to the show Matthew Stone, who is coming to us from the East Coast, from Virginia, to talk to us about Northern Virginia. And Michael, you are a professor of tourism and hospitality, I understand, and I'm going to get the school wrong,
George's Community College.
Prince George's Community College. And why does Prince George have a community college still?
You never know when you might need one. No, actually, it's a Prince George. A lot of the counties in Maryland are named after Prince George's, for example, or Anne Arundel historical figures, and so it's in Prince George's County, Maryland.
And why should someone come to Northern Virginia?
Well, I think when you're talking Northern Virginia, you can't really talk about Northern Virginia without talking about Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
So you can look at Northern Virginia two different ways, either as a side trip from Washington, D.C., or as a destination in itself. And when you talk about it as a destination, there's so much history here. There's so much natural beauty here, which people who might visit D.C. might want to add some natural beauty onto their trip. So between the history and the natural beauty, I think, are the two major reasons to come here.
And I think probably one of the questions we should ask is, what's the best time to visit? Because I know I have visited in not the best time before.
Summer is very hot and more crowded. Best time really is spring and fall, especially if you want to look at the leaves, all those things. Fall is great for that. And of course, in the spring is when all the blooming happens. The cherry blossoms bloom the last week of March, the first week of April every year. So spring and fall is the best time. Winter, there'll be no crowds, but it might be a little chilly.
Depending on where you're coming from and what you're used to. Chilly by California standards, but not by Midwestern standards, I think would be what we're looking at there.
The average high in February is 41 degrees, which isn't so cold, unless that day it's cold.
So if I were to come to Northern Virginia and to do it either as adding on, let's say, a week to a trip to Washington, D.C., or coming just to focus on that area, what kind of an itinerary would you recommend?
Well, I can start close to town, and I can work my way out. I'll do that, I believe. Arlington and Alexandria are on the Potomac River, which is right across from Washington, D.C. And if you look at a map of Washington, D.C., it was actually a diamond shape. And then in the 1840s, the federal government gave part of it back to Virginia, and that's what Arlington and Alexandria is. So we're that close to the nation's capital. We actually used to be part of the nation's capital before that. And actually, if you fly into Washington, D.C., you'll be flying into Northern Virginia, probably either into Reagan National Airport or into Dulles Airport, which is about 25 minutes away from D.C. And so when you start, of course, you start with history. You've got all the monuments here in Northern Virginia. The Iwo Jima Memorial is here. The famous Raising the Flag at Iwo Jima sculpture is here. Mm-hmm. You got the Air Force Memorial that's been built here now. The Pentagon Memorial, which actually you can't really go into the Pentagon unless you know somebody on the inside who can get you a tour. Unfortunately, I don't, so I can't get you into it. But on September 11th, as many people forget, a plane did hit the Pentagon also.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And a memorial did open up there also that's open to the public. History memorials there. And then Arlington National Cemetery, which most people come to D.C. and hit that at actually as one of the attractions here in D.C.
The old Lee family plantation.
It's such an interesting story, too, on that one. And people may forget or may not know that Washington and Lee's families were very closely related because it was Martha Washington's great-granddaughter who married Robert E. Lee. And they had this beautiful, beautiful home up on the hill overlooking the Potomac River, overlooking Washington, D.C., which is the Arlington House, as you mentioned. So the view from up on top of there is so beautiful. During the Civil War, various turn of events happened. It ended up in Union hands. I think they passed a law that said you have to pay your tax on your house in person. And Mrs. Lee was not really willing to come into Union-occupied lands to pay her taxes. So the government said, thanks, it's ours now. And it ended up being the Arlington National Cemetery, which is what it is to this day. I think it's 200 acres, something huge like that now.
Right. Yeah, no, they almost immediately then started burying the war dead in what couldn't have been anything other than an ironic or a intentional gesture there. But
yeah, it was intentional. I think originally a lot of freed blacks lived there on the land, and no one was using it for anything, and then they started burying Civil War dead there. There was a Civil War hospital there at one point in time, too, if you want to go that deep into the history of the area.
Okay. And where do we go next?
Well, I will take you over to Alexandria. Let's just start there. And as you fly in, a lot of times to Washington National Airport, you'll find this big 333-foot tall tower, for lack of a better word. And it is actually the George Washington Masonic Memorial. So when George Washington took over as president, he was the master of Alexandria Lodge when he was inaugurated president. And so they built this huge tower. If anybody's read the book, the Dan Brown book, Lost Symbol, it plays a role in that book too. So that's another famous memorial
Hmm.
over in Alexandria that somebody might see. And while we're talking about George Washington then, drive about 9 miles south of there and you're at Mount Vernon, which was his home. And it has been restored to the way it was when he was there by, I believe, the ladies of Mount Vernon. And there's a great museum there that just opened up a couple of years ago.
Now, I want to say that's not a national monument or national park, that it's privately run.
It is privately run. It's the ladies of Mount Vernon, I believe, who run that. And it was passed over to them years and years ago. But it is a great place to visit. The museum's wonderful. The home tour itself can be a bit rushed because they need to get everyone through as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. So you walk into a room, and these brilliant guides who know everything only get about 60 seconds to tell you everything they know. If you're lucky, they have time for a question. If not, you're moved on to the next room. But the museum there will fill in a lot of the blanks that they weren't able to fill in on the tour part.
So would it make sense to do the museum first and then the tour then?
Anytime in D.C., whether it's Mount Vernon or we're going to some of the parks, early in the morning is better. Okay. Before everyone makes it out there. So if you get there before 10, even on a weekend, you're probably okay. Great thing to know about Mount Vernon, you can buy your tickets online for a time ticket to get there. But do keep in mind, any time in the afternoon, parking will be a mess, especially in the summer or busy fall weekends out at Mount Vernon. Okay. And so just because you have a time might mean it's difficult to get there. And they've added a couple new tours. They have one that focuses on the movie National Treasure 2. Have you seen that movie?
Yes.
Okay, where they actually go into the basement of Mount Vernon?
Right.
Well, the movie wasn't filmed in the basement of Mount Vernon, but I believe on this tour they actually do take you into the basement just to check it out and see what it would look like. And it turns out the buried treasure isn't there, or I forget what the clue was, but no, it's really not there. But they will take you around, and they do capitalize on that movie on that tour if you sign up for that one. So
that's funny.
The Potomac River is beautiful, and that's something that just being in Washington, D.C., you might miss.
I think that's probably surprising, I would guess, to many visitors, especially that side of the river, just how pretty an area that is, especially considering how close you are into Washington, D.C. at that point.
It's gorgeous, yes. You can sit on the back behind Mount Vernon and overlook the Potomac River and the rolling hills. There isn't much there that looks different than when Washington was there. Surprising.
Well, of course, one difference is there was the story that Washington once threw $1 across the river, but of course the dollar went further in those days.
That's a good one. I'm going to use that one over and over again. When you're talking about the Potomac, too, you can talk about all the places to see along the Potomac River. Mm-hmm. So if you fly into Reagan National Airport, the flight path usually goes right along the river, and you land. And then you might see right there on the banks of the river, there's a beautiful park called Gravelly Point Park, where people will be out picnicking, people will be out running along the river. If anyone's taken the D.C. Ducks tour, they'll know this park because that's where the D.C. Ducks, which is the amphibious vehicle, and they'll sit there in the water and the planes land right above your head. So it's for plane spotters, it's a cool spot too. Gravelly Point Park, right by the National Airport. And then also in Arlington, and this is all within, a 9-mile stretch, really. Right across from Georgetown, across from the Kennedy Center, is an island called Theodore Roosevelt Island Park. Mm-hmm. And this is something you don't know unless you're a local for the most part. You can rent a canoe on the Georgetown side, which is in Washington, or a kayak, and go along the Potomac River there. Or you can access this park from a bridge from the Arlington side of the river. And it's an island, and it's like Jurassic Park. There's nothing on this island. It's this beautiful woods, and people go running there. You can go hiking there. And it's literally 200 yards from the Kennedy Center, or from civilization. I mean, it feels like you're in another place entirely.
Interesting.
Except for the statue of Theodore Roosevelt, which is almost Stalin-esque in its hugeness and the way it is so grand. So a lot of visitors come to D.C. and you get all the monuments and you get all the history of it. And we have a lot of that history over here in Northern Virginia also, whether it's Arlington, Alexandria, farther afield. But way back in the days before people could go too far on vacation, they'd go nearby on their trips. And another, speaking of the Potomac River, maybe about 25 minutes away from Arlington or from Georgetown. And it's just up at the Potomac River, and it's called Great Falls. Have you ever heard of Great Falls?
I have not.
It's actually part of the National Park Service system. It's not a national park. It's actually beautiful waterfalls in the Potomac River. So in the olden days, you had to pick up your canoe and go around it because people didn't kayak in those days over the falls. And there used to be amusement parks out there too. So you take a little railroad from Northern Virginia out to Great Falls for the day and enjoy the outdoor activities. But there's still all these miles of hiking trails out there to go right along the river, overlooking these beautiful bluffs along the river. A lot of people will do rock climbing there. They'll do rock climbing lessons. You can hire people to take you out there, and they'll rock climb actually right along the banks of the Potomac because there are cliffs out there. That one's just a great little day trip from D.C. If you're here for a week and one of the days you want to get out of the city, if you're from anywhere within a several-hour radius and you've already done Washington, D.C., and you want to start hitting some natural sites, that's a great place to go for that. And it floods quite often, which is why there's no more amusement park there anymore. But hiking trails are still very beautiful out there. On a spring or fall weekend, again, that's something you're going to want to get to before noon. You can bring your picnic lunch and all that, but afternoon it's going to be a parking lot just to get out there. Because, of course, you've got all the D.C. people going out there and all their out-of-town guests are all coming around. So a lot of the spots in Northern Virginia are for people who may have been to D.C., they want to hit something new, or all those people who come to visit the friends and family in D.C. What else can we do? I've already seen the Lincoln Memorial. I've already seen the Smithsonian. Where do I go next?
And any trick to getting around Northern Virginia? My impression is that rush hour is not so rushed and longer than an hour in the traffic in that particular area.
Yeah, they say, I think we're second to L.A. or something like that in traffic. A wonderful thing, Arlington and Old Town Alexandria. Arlington actually was built up to utilize the metro. And like I said, Arlington is right here. And so that's where a lot of people, I always recommend people to stay in Arlington if they want to visit Washington, D.C. It is so convenient because the hotels are right by the metro. The hotel tax here is 5% less in Virginia than it is in D.C. Food tax is 5% less. So when you're staying for a week, you can save a few bucks.
Well, it's also a very pretty area, too, downtown Arlington.
Arlington is beautiful, and the way they've built it up, right around the metro stops, it'll be a small little downtown area. We'll have farmers markets in the spring and fall and all summer long. And then when you walk about 2 blocks away from that, there'll be parks and running trails and all that. So if you're with your family, too, if you're with kids, it is kind of good to be somewhere where you can take them to a park. They start too much energy after walking around D.C., which no one ever does, actually. D.C. wears everybody out.
But my take is if I want to go south from there, I'm pretty much going to need a car, in which case I'm just going to have to time it to not be on the roads during rush hour, which are so brutal.
Yeah, not being on the roads during rush hour is tricky, and also Interstate 66, which is one of the major freeways here, it actually goes to carpool only. The entire freeway is carpool only during rush hour.
Oh, my. Okay.
Certain ways. So that's something you want to definitely check out before you go. If you're a couple of people in a car, you're fine, but there are times of day when you can't even get on the interstate unless you're 2 people in a vehicle. But then again, if you're staying, whether in D.C. or Arlington or Alexandria, there are local rental car places. So you can grab a rental car easily and just head out for one day.
Okay.
When you're headed out, there's a couple good museums here. May as well bring that up at some point in time. The Smithsonian has the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. It's not big enough to fit a Concorde or a space shuttle or an SR-71 Blackbird. So out by Dulles Airport. And Dulles Airport, again, is about 25 minutes from Washington, D.C. Huge museum there called the Udvar Hazy Center. It's part of the Smithsonian. So again, that's free. It is, I believe, $10 to park there. But the museum itself is free. And that's where the Smithsonian puts all the airplanes that won't fit on the mall in Washington. So that's a pretty interesting place to go.
Okay. Now, I am, as you probably know from listening to the show, a big fan of history. If I still haven't, through all of that, all of the D.C. and all of the Northern Virginia, gotten enough, where else in Northern Virginia would I find some of the history of the area?
Old Town Alexandria, which again is right on the banks of the Potomac River, easily accessible by the metro system from anywhere. And that's going to be a lot of the historic buildings from the 1800s. That's a great place to go in the evening because the restaurants are open late, art galleries are open late. If you're there on a Friday and Saturday, it's first date central. So if anyone in Northern Virginia wants a romantic first date or a romantic date, they kind of go to Old Town Alexandria because it does have that character.
Okay.
Old days. And I guess you go to Gap while you're there too, but there's a lot of historical places. A couple small museums there. I think that Alexandria's Black History Museum. There's an Apothecary Museum. Gadsby's Tavern you can eat in, but there's a museum there also. But it's kind of more neighborhoody type feel. It's going to kind of look like it did a long time ago, plus a few souvenir shops and galleries and all that. Civil War history, a lot of that happened around here. You can get that at Arlington House, which we talked about. Manassas, or when I went to school, it was called Bull Run.
So you went to school in the north?
I did go to school in the north, yes.
Okay. Manassas in the south and Bull Run in the north.
Exactly. I had to clear it up for whoever might have gone to school somewhere differently, right?
Well, for the strangest reason, the north named battles after the nearest body of water and the south after the nearest town, which always made a little more sense to me. But
so if you want to be a Civil War traveler, you may never need to go in as far as Alexandria, Arlington, Northern Virginia. Manassas and Bull Run is, again, within 30 minutes, really. And a lot of the smaller towns around here, which have become, over time, suburbs.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Where people are exurbs even, but they were historic downtowns before that. So if you're in Fairfax, Virginia, there's a Fairfax Museum there that is kind of, all of this will touch on the history of the area from colonization through the slave days, through Civil War into more present times. And then farther afield, I'm going to take you to West Virginia, if that is okay.
Okay.
Because, believe it or not, Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, is about an hour, 30 minutes from Washington, D.C. It's about 65 miles away. And so that's really just outside of Northern Virginia. And that, of course, was the famous John Brown raid back in 1859.
Mm-hmm.
He was a little bit crazy. He was an abolitionist, and he tried to take over the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry and then use the weapons he gathered to free slaves across the area. So he was well-intentioned, but he was captured and then hung over there. But Harper's Ferry is now a National Historic Site. It's in the National Park System. And so it's got a lot of great history of the enslaved African-American experience, freed African-American experience, and then history of the time. That was actually a city where free blacks and slaves lived both in the city at the same time. And over there's more natural stuff to do. People go tubing on the river in the summer. You can rent canoes, kayaks over there. There are some beautiful hiking trails that look down over the city. And the city is actually on a peninsula at the confluence of the Potomac and the Shenandoah River. My favorite hike in the area is Great Falls. It's my favorite close hike, 25 minutes from the city. And my favorite hour-and-a-half away hike is the hike at Harper's Ferry. It's absolutely beautiful.
Okay. What's going to surprise me when I come to the area, especially the first time?
I think you're going to be surprised that there's life outside of Washington, D.C. I think I was visualized Northern Virginia as just being suburbs of D.C. and being like suburbs of Chicago or suburbs of Indianapolis, where nothing particularly happens when people go to sleep at night. And that there's history here, beautiful parks. There's destination restaurants that people come from D.C. to come to these restaurants, or live music clubs, or the 2009 Regional Tony Award winner. The Tony Awards gives one theater a year an award for regional theaters, and Arlington, Virginia, the Signature Theater, won that award in 2009. You've got people leaving D.C. to come to the quote-unquote suburbs for culture. So that's something that really surprised me about this. You read a guidebook and really focuses so much on Washington, and Arlington National Cemetery, and misses all the rest of the experience, I think.
When people come to visit you, when friends come to visit you, as probably a lot of people do because of where you're located, a place that a lot of families like to go to especially, what do you take them to that surprises them or that I've never heard of?
Wine country. How's that wine?
Oh, okay. That works.
Would you have come to Virginia? Well, you're in California. Why would you come to Virginia for wine, right? And once you had Virginia wine, you might not change your opinion. But I believe Virginia has I teach, hospitality, tourism, culinary arts, so I guess I should know something about wine. I think Virginia has the sixth most number of wineries of any state in the country. And if you date all the way back to Jefferson, he spent some time in France, and he was always trying to grow grapes here in Virginia. Never was very successful, but nowadays they've gotten to work out right. This is one of the color counties where actually it's called Loudoun County, Virginia, and they call it D.C. wine country. It's not quite as convenient as Napa, where you can just drive down one road and all the wineries line up on either side for you. but it is all in one county. I think they've got over 20 wineries just in that county. And again, because it's at the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, you've got some beautiful views. In the summer, they've got live bands or tastings. You can sit on the patio and look at the fall, watch the leaves change colors. If you sit there long enough or drink enough wine, you'll see the leaves change colors. And for those who don't really feel like driving that far away, you can actually take a wine tour that picks up in D.C., just like you would in Napa, where you can take a limo or a small group tour that'll drop you at several different wineries and check that out. So,
okay. What day have you had, let's say in the last couple of years, that made you really say, thank God I live in Northern Virginia?
It's one of those days, one of those beautiful fall days or beautiful spring days, and you want to go do something outdoors. And I've lived in a lot of big cities where it'd be an hour and a half, 2 hours just to get outside the city limits. And here, and when you can get 20 minutes away and be at Great Falls and hiking out where you could be at any national park anywhere where it's that pretty and that nice, and then be home and go into D.C. for anything you want to. So it'd be a day like that. Or the first time I ever crossed the bridge over to the Theodore Roosevelt Island, I'd always seen it. I'd passed by it a million times, driving by it. And one day I want to go over and see what's on that island. And you go on that island and it's quiet and you just, where on earth did I just drop myself? But you're in the middle of a major metropolitan area. So. A couple books I'd recommend for Northern Virginia once you get outside of your Washington, D.C. guidebooks. A lot of Civil War history here. One is called 50 Amazing Things You Must See and Do in the Greater D.C. Area. Okay. And it's actually, I think you'd love it. It's a photographer who wrote it, so it's got the beautiful pictures.
Okay.
But it takes you to Maryland and Virginia, down to Shenandoah National Park. And Shenandoah National Park, it's about 65 miles from Washington, D.C. And so that's the Blue Ridge Parkway. I think over 1 million people a year go there to travel. So you can make that a day trip from Virginia. You can go down there and hit the small towns of Virginia. That's a book that when it's a weekday and what do I want to do this weekend, I pick up that book just to see where do I want to go this weekend. What looks beautiful? The weather's going to be nice. I don't want to be indoors at a museum. I don't want to be in my house. I want to be outside, and that kind of tells me where to go.
Okay.
There's also one called 50 Hikes in Northern Virginia. And when I say hikes, these aren't hikes you have to be a hiker to do. And so when I say Great Falls Park, you don't need to be a hiker to do that hike. It's just for anybody.
Any places you would recommend in terms of staying or places you would recommend to eat?
Arlington is really great and neighborhoody. And Arlington, of course, is so easily metro accessible. There's a neighborhood in Arlington called Clarendon. There's a metro stop right there. It has, your normal Cheesecake Factory in that. But also in Arlington, it's called Ray's Hellburger. And Ray's is the famous steakhouse here in the area. And so Ray's Hellburger opened up, and it's like a gourmet burger spot. And I believe Obama came over here and ate, and wherever he eats, and everybody else wants to eat there, right? Also in that same neighborhood, Eventide is an upscale restaurant that just opened up. Another one, Clarendon Ballroom, is great for happy hour. It's a pretty young neighborhood, pretty vibrant neighborhood. But even if you're not under 30, you will still fit in that area. It's very walkable. And it's more restaurants and bars than nightclubs. So it's not a nightclub district.
Okay.
There's a couple live music venues there if you're into live music. For your younger listeners, the Iota Club and the Galaxy Hut. And that's kind of where you see a lot of up-and-coming artists are going to play there. And you realize later on, wow, they played at the Iota Club 5 years ago before they were famous. And so again, I like to stay near the metro, so I'd stay in Clarendon, Courthouse, or Ballston neighborhoods. Those are all metro stops, right on the way into Washington, D.C. Or in Alexandria, in Old Town Alexandria, because you can eat there, you can shop there, and you can stay there also.
Best money-saving tip?
Best money-saving tip? Spend some time in Northern Virginia instead of Washington, D.C.
Okay.
You'll see on forums online where people are like, well, I didn't realize that the food tax in Washington, D.C. is 10%, and the food tax in Northern Virginia is 5%. And so you can see how that would save you pretty quick. Don't rent a car until you need one.
Right.
So plan those things all for one day. So the day where you do want to go to Mount Vernon, or you do want to go to wine country, that's the only day you need a car for. And there's car rentals places in all the neighborhoods.
Okay.
And so if you fly into National Airport, which is metro accessible, closest airport in that Washington, D.C., you won't need a car pretty much for most of the time you're here. And cabs are plentiful and pretty inexpensive.
Although my problem is I always find better flights going into Dulles.
Coming in from Dulles, you can do that also. You really want a money-saving tip, and you want to explore outside of the D.C. area, stay out by Dulles Airport, because it is going to be a lot cheaper out there, out by Dulles Airport. But there is a coach bus that will bring you in, and there's a metro bus that goes out to Dulles Airport.
Okay.
And if you want to sit on a city bus and with your baggage, that's kind of tricky to do. But there's a coach bus called Washington Flyer, which it's $10, and it drops you off at the metro. So for $10, it'll bring you in and drop you at the West Falls Church Metro Station, which is 2 stops from Arlington. So you don't need to take a $60 cab. And they are building a Metro link right now to Dulles Airport.
Oh, it's about time.
It will be open in 2000 and
Yeah.
someday.
As we go to wind this down, you really know you're in Northern Virginia when what?
And I think it's when you look behind a tree or you're driving along the George Washington Parkway and you see the beautiful Potomac River, and right behind it is the skyline of D.C. The best views of Washington, D.C. are from the Virginia side of the river. And so you'll just be driving along, or I'll be walking up a street, and you look out between the trees, and there's the Washington Monument. That's when you know you're in Northern Virginia.
Okay. And if you had to summarize Northern Virginia in 3 words, what 3 words?
I'd have to call it historic.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be green.
Mm-hmm.
And it'd actually be pretty lively, whether it's restaurants or entertainment, those type of things.
Great. Well, Matthew, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people read more about what you have to say in your writings on travel?
Now, you can read me at globalpostmark.com, which is my blog, or I'm on Twitter also at globalpostmark.
Great. Well, Matthew, thank you so much for coming on the show.
All right, thanks so much, Chris.
I have one internet resource for you today, and that's a site called Stood There. The site gives you ideas of places to get your picture taken, like the 100 greatest places to stand in the UK. So check that out, stoodthere.com. In news of the community, I heard from John, who left some clarifications or corrections as a comment on the Travel to Yemen episode. I have traveled extensively in Yemen and just wanted to leave a few comments. One, there are many very fine 4- and 5-star hotels, including Western brands in Sana'a, not just one as was mentioned in the interview, Movenpick, Mercure, Sheraton. 2, U.S. troops do not vacation in Yemen. In fact, U.S. government employees must obtain permission to go to Yemen even on leisure trips due to safety concerns. Embassy staff are limited in their travel outside of Sana'a. 3, U.S. UK Canadian citizens and citizens of most other countries now need a visa in advance to travel to Yemen. Until February of 2010, most were able to get a visa on arrival at the airport in Sana'a. 4, the U.S. State Department, UK Foreign Office, and the equivalents of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and many other countries suggest deferring all non-essential travel to Yemen at this time. While these government warnings are usually overblown, they are important to mention. I'm shocked that your guest did not even mention these warnings. They are important to read before thinking about a trip to Yemen. The security situation is deteriorating quickly across Yemen. 5, I was also surprised not to hear anything about the beautiful islands off the southern coast of Yemen. These islands are probably the safest part of Yemen and some of the best and some of the most beautiful in the world. I think we actually did mention them just briefly, but our guest had not been there. John, thanks so much for those clarifications and corrections. And then I also heard from Kathy, and Kathy left a comment on the 3 weekend trips from Shanghai episode, number 227. I spent a couple weeks in Hangzhou and Suzhou, haven't made it to Nanjing yet. A few additions. Hangzhou, a boat trip to the islands in the lake is definitely worthwhile. I took a bus to Lingying Sea, the temple of inspired seclusion, big with elaborately decorated statues and a huge pavilion housing imaginative statues. I was there on National Day and the town was absolutely packed with Chinese tourists. If you want a quiet time, probably better to go midweek or a non-holiday week. Suzhou, there are several gardens to choose from. I found the humble administrators too big and not as interesting as the Garden for Lingering and the Master of Nets, or even less famous Yi Yuan and Kanling Ting. When I was there, the Master of Nets was open in the evening with performances of Chinese music and dance, rather touristy, but the garden was magical at night. I particularly enjoyed visiting the Museum of Embroidery, not really a museum, but a work room with women doing silk embroidery that looked like paintings. The silk factory can be skipped if you've seen silk production elsewhere. I found the bus system in Suzhou particularly easy to use, as the stops on the main street had maps. Kathy, thank you so much for those comments. Again, if you're looking at saving money on a Globus, Cosmos, Monogram, or Avalon tour, or cruise in the last case, I can save you 10% if you book through the Amateur Traveler, and that helps support the show. Just go to amateurtraveler.com/Globus, and Globus is spelled Globus. And again, if you're interested in the Egypt tour, especially the cruise, better book now. And you can find more information about that at amateurtraveler.com/tours. If you are interested in advertising on the Amateur Traveler, or you know someone who is, drop me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com, or if you have a question, use that same email address. You can also leave a comment on the show at the website, amateurtraveler.com, or catch me on Twitter at Chris2X. I did want to say one thing about leaving a comment on the episodes. If you do that, please make it clear that you actually heard the episode, because I get a lot of spam comments, and there are things like, this was a really interesting post that's actually on a podcast episode, and so if it's something that generic and vague, I will probably delete it because I'll be mistakenly thinking that it is a spam comment. So again, just include something that lets me know that you actually heard or read whatever it is that you're commenting on. You may remember that a while back I was advertising Audible.com, and I'm doing that again. Audible is a site you can use to get audiobooks. I am a subscriber of Audible.com, and I enjoy that. If you're interested in getting a 14-day free trial and a free book, just go to amateurtraveler.com/freebook. And I think that's plugging enough products for 1 week, so just let me say thanks so much for listening.
Got to see one more cathedral. Got to sit in one